Welcome to Your Career Unscripted. I'm your host, Jane Bernhard. I will be interviewing business leaders and recent graduates on the different perspectives, strategies, challenges, and advice on building meaningful careers across different generations. There's no right way to build your career or live your life. And I'm so excited that this show is in collaboration with Texas Immersive Institute at the University of Texas. We hope to help you define success on your terms and not anyone else's. Our guest today is Victor Pineiro. Victor is an award-winning digital marketer, author, documentary filmmaker, and game designer. Currently the Director of Digital Innovation and Creators at Max, Victor's team has launched emerging tech activations like the House of the Dragon Raise Your Banners AI poster generator experience and DracARys app, alongside brand and series-focused influencer campaigns. Before Max, Victor spent a decade leading YouTube, Skittles, and various other brands' social presences. He also wrote, produced, and marketed the award-winning metaverse documentary Second Skin, South by Southwest '08 opening night movie. He followed it up with the documentary that launched Motherboard, Vice's tech channel. He's also designed games and toys for Hasbro and is a kidlit and young adult author. He wrote Time Villains, a Kirkus and Amazon Best Book of the Year and winner of the International Latino Book Award. Hi, Victor. So excited to have you on the podcast. When I think about why I wanted to have you on the podcast, there's 1,000 reasons. One, you're super creative and you've had such a very cool creative career. You have so many different facets to your career. You've been a creative director, you've been a writer, you work in innovation at Max. So cool. But the biggest reason I wanted to have you on the show is truly in the business world, you're one of the nicest and most supportive people I've met.
Thanks.
Truly, you're so kind and you're so incredibly supportive and you've helped me a lot. And so I really wanted to just ask you questions, share more of your story, because I think you have a lot of advice and wisdom to share to young people. So thank you for being here.
I hope so. My pleasure. So excited.
So storytelling seems to be the cornerstone of your career. You currently work in media, but you've also worked as a writer. You've been a producer. You've been a creative director. You've written books, but you also work with influencers, and that's super, super creative. And especially marketing is all about telling stories. And now you're a director of digital innovation at Max, also super creative. Can you tell us where you got your passion for telling stories and what inspires you about the power of content?
Sure. I think for a lot of folks, not all, but for a lot, I think it comes from childhood. I think honestly, a lot of it is my mom is a huge storyteller. She's always telling us stories ever since we were very young. And so I became very voracious into reading stories myself, and kind of getting into them. It's funny. So I have a 3-year-old, and you know, when you have them and you're like, oh, is this what I was like as a kid? This kid is it's his voraciousness for stories is unbelievable. Like he would literally just have me sit on a couch and tell him stories from the moment he wakes up to the moment he sleeps. It's always like a story, here's a book, another story. I'm like, oh, is this me? I don't baby. So I think a lot of it comes from these early experiences we have with telling and reading stories, which is why, we'll get into it. But my first job was an elementary school teacher. And for me, telling parents is hey, just read to your kids, have them read. It's the most important thing. Get them into this early. So yeah, I think that's the biggest one. And then in terms of the power of content and stories and all that, honestly, as I get older, as I spend more time in all these different industries, it sounds a little cliche, but I do think storytelling is always the narrative, the thread that's between all of the things that I've been in. And I think for so many things, I'm not going to say reduce, you can look at anything through the lens of storytelling. You can look at an accountant's job through storytelling. You can look at anything you're doing can be seen through the lens of storytelling. And there's something that's so primal about it that there's such a need, not only the way that I see my toddler asking for stories, I think the way that you in your mind are always, putting things through the lens of stories. And I think there's just such a power to it. And it's such a primal thing that, yeah, that's the power.
I love hearing about your toddler. That's hilarious and so sweet. And I wish that adults kept that imagination, like some do as they get older. But speaking of kids, so you taught third grade. at the beginning of your career, and you
Yep.
taught filmmaking to middle schoolers and high schoolers. So it seems like you've always loved film. Like you said, you've always been creative. You've always loved stories. We're going to dive into the more corporate part of your career, but I'm also just curious how working with young people and even just having kids influences your understanding of imagination.
Sure. And I'm a big proponent of starting a career in education, no matter where you want to go with it. I think it's just this amazing foundation. I stumbled into it. I didn't think that's what I was going to do. I was going to go into filmmaking, then I stumbled into education instead. And I think, it was an incredible introduction to everything because you just learn not to be precious because you see how kids tell stories. You see how not precious they are. You see how storytelling is really just play and people like, playing, and when you start contextualizing it around like, oh, that's what I used to do as a kid. I used to tell stories like that and we used to co-create stories together. It really helps you be less precious of your ideas. So going from teaching kids to not that many years later, flipping over and being, kind of in the creative path on an agency is like, oh, the biggest difference I see is as we get older, we get far more precious with our ideas. We hold on to the ones we think are great. We don't let them free. And I think it's like, oh no, look how the kids do it. That should be the same way that we're thinking about it now. We're all just kind of playing and building on each other's ideas and hopefully having fun while we do it. So that to me, I think is a lot of it. I think the other half is teaching kids because it was elementary school. A lot of what you're doing is reading to kids, whether it's formal or whether it's like, oh, it's the end of the day, let's just read a story. So you really get a sense for what makes a story memorable, what keeps kids' attention. And I think the backbone of marketing to me is attention. It's just how do you get and hold on to attention? So I think you see it with children. You see how it works. You see like, oh, this is what they're into with the story. Oh, this is why they're obsessed with Harry Potter or Pokemon or whatever it is. You start taking it apart in your head. You're like, okay, I'm starting to understand what works and what doesn't about storytelling. So I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when you see kids and the way their imaginations work, they are so free. And then as we get older, you develop so much structure and like, oh, there's a right way or a wrong way or a framework or all of that. But I love what you're saying about just like the freedom and letting things go and not just sticking to something because you just want to get it done or you think it's a good idea. So you have written books as well for third to eighth graders about villains, magic, adventure, monsters. I cannot tell you how much I love that and how wonderful that is. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing, where you get your inspiration from? Was it the kids that you taught? And even just the topics that you write about, where does that come from?
Sure. Yeah. So the dream since I was like 8 years old was to be a writer. So that was the original dream. And then, the short version is as I was getting close to graduating college, I was like, well, I've undiagnosed, but very sure I have pretty big ADHD. So I couldn't get a book out. There were so many things that would keep me from writing long form. So my brother and I got really into, I got into writing scripts and he was a movie maker. So we got into making movies. And so my path took a lot of different twists and turns, but the background always was how do I write books? And, gosh, when was it? I think like 2017, maybe. I said, you know what? Here's what I'm going to do. I have a commute. I'm on I live in Long Island, so it takes me about half an hour each way on a train. I'm going to just write every single day on the commute and see what happens. And it was brutal at first. But once the habit gets going, I found that I was doing it. And it took me about 3 years to write my first book. And then the hardest thing to do is read it and say, okay, this is definitely not publishable. Put it away. And then say, I have to start again. And then the second time, it was like, you know what? Let me go into this second one. What I really want to do is I want to experience the ins and out of publishing so I can get better, at figuring out what it means to be a writer and how I write. So the second book, I'm like, I'm just going to write a book that feels very fun and marketable. I started writing this adult fiction literary book. I got maybe a week in. I was like, this is miserable. And then I stepped back. I was like, wait a second. Look at the through line of your life. You have been a third and fourth grade teacher. I worked for Hasbro. That was like my favorite thing I did. It's all kid stuff. Like, why don't you go back to what you like doing? So I said, okay, I'm going to write the book I wish I'd read as a kid. And that's what I wrote. I spent the next couple of years writing that. And then I won't go into the ins and outs, but, eventually found an agent and then an editor. And then they wanted to make it into a series. So I'm on book 2 of that series. We've paused the series and now I'm working on a third book for them, which I think comes out in next August. And then I'm working on a bunch of other books. And it's tricky because, a lot of folks, I think two important things to say here. I think if you're younger and you're listening to this podcast, I think it's to go easy on yourself with this stuff. My first book got published and when did it get published? 2021. Let me do the math. Yeah, I was over 40. Like I would have, if I was in my 20s and I heard that, I think I would have had a panic attack, but it's totally fine. It's what happened. And I really appreciate getting into kind of being an author at this age, because I think I'm a lot less stressed about, what it means to succeed in the industry. And I think it gives you a big leg up to be a little bit more relaxed about that, because it's such a topsy-turvy industry.
I think that's great advice. And one thing I also think that's super helpful is you saying that it was hard to kind of get started. Because I think so often people feel like I have so much creativity and all these ideas, and they just can't get themselves to actually push themselves to start. So I think what you mentioned about just, this is my time to do it, whatever comes out of this comes out, and then look at everything that you created from getting started.
Yeah, 100%. Exactly. And I guess, if we're on the topic, just advice that I wish I had. So I probably not wasted, but almost wasted almost like a decade, because I didn't realize the kind of writer I was. So if you who are listening are in this situation, here's my advice. There's a spectrum of writing styles, and it tends to be between two different poles. One is called the pantser method, like writing by the seat of your pants, which is you open your computer and you start writing, and whatever comes out, comes out. The other side is the plotter, which is somebody who outlines and outlines and outlines and outlines, and at the very end takes a really in-depth outline and connects the dots. I would say experiment with both. I spent years thinking I was a plotter, and I wasted so much time, because what I realized is I needed to write a very vague outline and then just jump into it. And I really, the joy of discovering what to write was the best part of it. But there are people who swear that they hate that and they just want to plot something out first. So my advice is, be very, very not precious. Write absolutely. Your first draft is going to be awful. And if it's just not working, if your method is not working, try to kind of go down the spectrum a little bit. If you're starting to write and you have nothing to write about, try outlining a little bit. If outlining is really boring to you, try jumping in and experimenting. So, yeah.
That is so interesting. I've never heard someone break that down into those two categories, because I wrote one play. Nice. And I was 100% mapping everything out before I wrote it. I was definitely the second category you described. Like I literally went to CVS and I got poster boards, and I was like, okay, I'm going to draw the connection. Yes. This character starts this and it ends this, and this is the transition, and drawing lines. And literally it was just poster board, but I'd never thought about there being two different types of people. But it makes sense. If you're someone who just does really well with just getting started and see what happens, you could be kind of hindered by putting together an outline and then feeling stuck.
Exactly. And I think a lot of folks who come, and it's perfect that you said play, because I think a lot of what happens is if you come more from plays or screenwriting, which is where a lot of creative folks start nowadays, especially screenwriting, especially if you're screenwriting towards selling it, it's such a structure-based process that's where I started screenwriting too. So I have there's a lot of people who teach a class based on a deck that I made once, which is literally how to structure a story before you write it. So I was already in that mode. So it was so hard for me to say, oh, when you write books, you don't have to structure it all up front. So
I love that. And can you tell us a little bit about how your creativity, your writing experience, your producing experience, all of that informs your work in the more corporate world at Max or at Big Spaceship? Like how do those two kind of come together?
100%. I think a lot of different ways. I think when you start on a creative path, and especially if you go into, I would say maybe a little bit more so an agency, but either side of it, the first thing you're going to learn, I said it already once, is you're going to learn to be a lot less precious with your ideas. I think it's really hard for a lot of people. It was super hard for me. I feel like because my brother and I grew up making tons and tons of short films and movies, we had nobody else telling us what to do. It didn't matter if the movie was objectively good or bad. We just made it. So I think by the time I got into the corporate world, it was like, oh my God, this is a great idea. What are you doing? You can't destroy this idea yet. But you kind of learn. It's almost like a crash course in learning the path of a creative idea, and as it kind of grows and all the false starts. And, as a creative director friend of mine once said, if you spend 3 days and at the end of those 3 days, you trash everything you've done, it still wasn't a waste. There are things that you figured out in those 3 days that can then rebuild something more interesting. So I think when you start, if you get into any kind of creative profession, I see it with, writing with me. One of my best friends is a fine artist. I see it with him. You start to understand that it goes both ways. When you write, maybe it's the writing that teaches you how not to be precious as you get through creating a manuscript or your own personal art. Or when you're in the job, you realize not to get precious, because then you take that and you apply it to your learning. And I think it all kind of works together. So that to me is one thing. I think the second thing is, when you start in most careers in a creative field, you are the creative. You're the one who's making stuff. And eventually, almost inevitably, a large percentage of those folks are going to become managers, and you're going to manage creative people. You're going to become, maybe you're a creative director, maybe you're, strategy director, whatever the form takes. And it's a very different skill set. And I think what doing things on the side or before you did this, or kind of having a background in something else, helps you, is it helps you understand, oh, this is what it's like. Because it's one thing to be a creative person in an industry where you're, let's say you're creating a campaign. It's one thing for somebody to shoot down your ideas for a marketing campaign. It's another thing for somebody like an agent to shoot down your creative ideas on the side. It's a lot more brutal. So if you understand what it feels like to get your creative ideas shot down or shifted or whatever happens inevitably being in a creative field on your personal life, then I think you have a lot more empathy and you understand how to navigate folks as you're a creative director or whatever you might be in your professional life.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. So you mentioned kind of the differences between being the creative in the corporate world and then managing those people. How did it feel for you to transition to a leadership role where you're managing other people and you kind of are doing, and please describe more of what you're doing now, but you're managing a team and you have to use a different skill set than your writing skill set and all of that. And as you mentioned, you bring more empathy and understanding because you understand people's processes. But what was your learning curve like for that kind of transition?
Yeah, it's one of the wildest things about so many jobs, which is, people talk about it all the time, because it's like you've spent so many years becoming successful at doing one thing, and then you have to shift some enormous percentage of what your entire job is. And you're like, wait, I'm really good at this. Now you're having me do this thing way over here. It was a big learning curve. And that's, again, why I say education is an incredible foundation for anyone starting their career. Because what I found is when I was creative on my own, or obviously on teams, but I wasn't managing, I was drawing a lot from my experience being creative growing up. But when I switched to managing, the first thing I noticed was like, oh my God, this is teaching. This is the exact same thing. Obviously, in one set, my kids were 7 to 9 years old, and the other, they were not. but it's so many of the principles are exactly the same. And I remember the CEO of the agency we were in some meeting, and the president of Hasbro was asking me like, oh, it sounds like you have an interesting background. And I was telling about the documentary. I was like, yeah, I was a documentary filmmaker. And the CEO said, wait. The more important part is that you were an elementary school teacher. And at the time I was like, no, it's cool that I was a documentary filmmaker. He's like, no. Your success is because you were an elementary school teacher. And he kind of blew my mind. I was like, oh, that's why education is such a great foundation. So many things you learn about in managing a classroom, in, managing students, even in creating report cards. That's all the same stuff. You're learning the strengths and weaknesses of a child and how to help them grow and mature in what they're doing. It's the same skill set. You're just transposing it into a different key.
Yeah. You know what's so interesting when I think about it? Because when I was looking at your trajectory, I didn't know that you started off as a teacher. And here's why that makes sense to me when I read that and why I wanted to discuss it. You come off in all of our conversations, you do not have an ego in terms of like, so many people in the business world have a big ego and their level of humility isn't super high. And you are very humble and very down to earth and very grounded and very, very kind. So when I read that you were a teacher to kids, I was like, that makes sense. Of course that makes sense. Kids will humble you.
Yes.
And like, they're a tough audience.
Oh yeah.
And then when you go into the corporate world and you're like, I started with kids, like you guys are like,
exactly.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
You nailed it.
Yeah. I'm curious. Can you walk us through your career a little bit? Cause you created a documentary, you worked at an agency. Can you walk us through your career? And can you also tell us a little bit about what your life felt like and what your days felt like when you were in those different roles? Because I think one of the things that I hope will be helpful to people about this podcast is understanding like, oh, that career looks interesting, but this is what you're actually doing in it.
Yes, that is such a good question.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what you just said is the most important thing. It's what does a career look like, or what's the title versus what are you actually doing? I think that's huge. Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I've had a kind of strange path, and it's been very unexpected to me. And I just feel very lucky for it. So the short version, I guess, is when I was in college, the dream, as I said, was always to write books. But then starting around middle and high school, my brother and I spent all of our time making short films and making movies, and we kept growing in that. My brother's a couple years younger. So when I graduated high school, I thought, okay, well, I love two things. I love psychology and I love writing. And I'm too anxious to actually invest in being a writer. So I'm going to go psychology. Got into school. I realized that I didn't love the study of psychology as much as just general, psychology. So then I went around sociology. I was a social anth major for a while, jumped around. When I finally graduated, I thought, okay, I want to take a minute and try to fulfill what I think my dream is. And my dream was two parts. It was make a movie, become a screenwriter, and then eventually figure out how to write books and become a novelist. So I said, you know what? You only live once. Let me give this a quick try. And I had a wonderful film teacher who hooked me up with an internship at Killer Films, which was this big indie company at the time that had done a lot. It just come off of creating a lot of big hits in terms of indie movies. So I went in there and I spent 3 months there, and then I immediately got a job as a production assistant on set. And between those two experiences, I had this really semi-traumatic realization that I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I said, oh my God, okay, hold on. My dream is all of a sudden completely destabilized. And it was because, and I think a lot of people either will experience it, have experienced it, or might experience it, which is if you're coming into a profession like film and you're coming in as somebody who spent a lot of times either creating content, whether it's for social or creating movies on your own or short films, when you become starting out in that field is such a different skill set. You're doing very kind of backbreaking work all day, and it just wasn't for me. So I had a bit of a crisis, and as I was trying to figure out what to do, I was thinking about what else was I really into in college? And I remember being really surprised. Somebody pushed me into taking this elementary education class, and I loved it. I was like, you know what? Let me see if that's a thing. And so a few months later, all of a sudden I was a teacher, and I spent the next 6 years teaching and absolutely loved it in a lot of respects. I think that was the best job I've had, but I was very restless because I knew that I still had this very, a lot of hunger. I was very hungry to be a creative person and to start creating my own stuff. And I had never stopped doing that. My brother and I had worked on that on the back burner the entire time. So this was just showing you the randomness of life.
Yeah, no, I love it.
Here we go. It gets even more random. What happened was at 6 years in, I decided I was going to get my MFA in screenwriting at Columbia. So I applied, I got in, I was getting ready to do it. Now, at the same time, I was teaching at this school, and it was a very progressive school. So there were no walls in the school between classrooms. There were just a couple bookshelves. It was very open, pretty chaotic, but it was really interesting. The guy who taught right next to me, we were good friends at this point, and he was exhibiting a lot of signs of becoming an addict. And it was really scary to me because I was like, this is a fourth grade teacher. He is coming in with dark circles under his eyes. He is racing home at lunch and racing back. He lived 10 blocks away. He's having all these weird conversations on the phone between classes. What is wrong with this guy? I got very kind of nervous about it. I talked to him and he starts laughing. And he's like, I am addicted, but it's not to what you think. And he takes me to his apartment and he turns on his computer and he's addicted to this video game. I was like, wait, what? And he's addicted to, I think it's called an MMORPG. It's kind of a virtual world game. It's basically the grandfather or father of Fortnite and Roblox. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about World of Warcraft. We're talking about Second Life. And he starts getting me into it and showing me this. At the time, my brother and I are working on a feature film we're trying to create. I am about to get into Columbia. And we both see this thing he's going through. And my brother at this point is consulting and creating corporate documentaries. He just graduated college, and he and one of his friends are doing short documentaries for pharmaceutical companies. So we're talking, we're like, wait a second. You know what we should do? I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to turn down Columbia. You're going to quit your job. We're going to take all of your equipment that you have from doing these corporate documentaries, and we're going to make a documentary about these video games because they're fascinating. And long story short, what happened is because he showed this thing, he was kind of early adopter to this stuff. Because my friend was into this stuff early, we started making our documentary 6 months earlier than there were 10 other documentaries that were being made about this, because this became a really hot topic in the mid 2006 to 2010. it became more and more of a thing. These like MMORPGs, virtual worlds, virtual currencies, virtual economies. It became this huge topic. But we were so far ahead of everybody else that we were able to, when we started promoting our movie, when we finally finished making it, and we were showing off the trailer and put it online and YouTube, everything started going viral and people started paying a lot of attention. And we started getting interviewed by all these big, New York Times, LA Times, everybody was interviewing us about this movie. And suddenly it just started growing and growing and growing. And we became, it was the opening night movie of South by Southwest. So it was this really fantastic process. And I think a lot of it was because, we did the thing that some people say to do, some people warn you against, is we did the crazy, like, quit your job and see what happens in your 20s. And it ended up working out quite well for us. It doesn't always work out. I'm not going to say it does. But I think that, we learned a lot from that experience. We learned that we went from a place where we didn't know what we were doing to a place where through trial and error, we created something. We were able to get a really fantastic executive producer who helped us make this thing even better. And so for that job, so my first job was elementary education. I think you imagine what an elementary school teacher is like, and it's pretty accurate. This job was interesting because you're making a documentary. At least from my perspective, I was writing it and producing it. A lot of what I was trying to do is we were taking all these interviews in, and I was trying to craft a story out of it. And you see over time, when you're making a documentary, so much of it is, okay, where is the story in all of this footage? And like, is there a 3-act structure? And where are the stakes and where are the character stakes? And how does this person's story land? And you're taking a risk with everything you're doing there, right? So we followed 4 different sets of subjects. And one of them, their story just didn't go anywhere because this is real life. It's not like things really happen in our epic. But thankfully, the other 3 stories did go somewhere, or enough of a somewhere that we could make them into stories. So, that was the dream job. I think it was just such a fantastic experience. And a lot of it was, there's the flashier stuff, which is you go and you shoot the stuff and it's fantastic. But there's also like most of the time is spent very non-flashily transcribing interviews, threading together a story, having the tack board up there, and and what ended up happening, the next segue I made was, so the movie we'd finished filming the movie. My brother had directed it. And at this point, he was going to edit it. We had our friend who was going to work on all the legal contractual stuff, which was a huge beast. And they're like, well, Vic, I guess you have to market it because we're busy. I was all right, I'll do it. And I started doing something. And this to me is mostly just right time, right place. But I was doing, I was like, okay, how am I going to get attention for this teeny tiny movie? So I started blogging since the beginning of the experience. And I was blogging consistently for the 3 years we made it. And then I started, using, like, this is old school, but I started using MySpace. I started using, the first beginning year of Facebook, all these platforms to get people excited about it. And it ended up becoming this big hit. And while I think it was a hit because the subject matter was very hot, a lot of people said, no, it was the social media campaign. And this was one of the earliest social media movie campaigns that had kind of gotten this kind of attention. So they started asking me to talk at conferences and explain like how one does this. And then all of a sudden, just to kind of explain how like these life transitions happen, I went from, a very unstable filmmaking job where I was obviously in debt and not doing well financially to I'm about to get married. I need a little bit more stability in my life. And all these conferences have become agencies talking to me about doing this kind of stuff. So I flipped pretty quickly from being a documentary filmmaker to being a social media marketer. And it was quite unexpected. The next phase, for the next 10 years, I worked at an agency, fantastic agency called Big Spaceship. Absolutely can't say enough nice things about it. I went in as a social media, kind of the quote unquote, the social media guy. Nobody knew what that was at the time. It was very new. And again, right time, right place. When I first got there, they said, hey, we just got all this business from Wrigley. They have like 9 different brands. They want to bring them all to social media, and you're going to do that. I was like, okay. Back then, social media, there was no rich media. It was you're just writing one-liners. They're going on Twitter and Facebook. And so for 8 of those 9 brands, we did what you would expect. But for Skittles, the brand manager was this really great guy. And he said, hey, we've tried all this other weird stuff. It hasn't worked. What do you guys think we should do? And a friend of mine was working at this agency and we were talking about it. We're like, well, what if we just do day in the life? We make Skittles a character. We call him the Rainbow. And all of the posts are just day in the life of this guy. But he's weird. He's Skittles. He's just this WTF kind of dude. And so I was like, great, I can just let my like inner weirdo fly. So I just started writing really weird shit all the time. And it started vibing. And then I think the most surprising thing to all of us was people were liking it a lot. And I think it's because nobody else was doing it. Like, weird social wasn't really a thing yet. There were no brands that were like weird yet. So I think we were the first ones. And all of a sudden, we were the most engaged with brand. We, broke the record for the most like Facebook posts. Like we were breaking a lot of records, and it was just so funny because everyone's like, "What's the secret?" It's like, there's no secret. I'm just being weird. Like, I'm just not censoring myself in it. So that was a really interesting foray into it because it was kind of learning the how social media works at a very primal level, because it was very early days. Like, you put out a post, you read the comments, you understand what they like, you take those learnings, but it was all just one person doing this for 9 brands. And then obviously as social began to grow, all of that shifted, teams got bigger, and everything changed. So that was that. And I'm going to say the 9 to 5 there, a lot of the day-to-day, as you were asking, really was what you would do if you were a copywriter, just sitting at a computer and just cranking out as much copy as you could, figuring out what works, what doesn't, etc. A few years later, YouTube came knocking and said, "Hey, we want the Skittles guy to write for us." And that started as a similar thing where it was just myself and an intern. But again, if there's one thing you take away from the talk, it's like so many things happen randomly, and being just at the right place at the right time because you're putting yourself out there. So right place, right time. What happened was we came in with a very specific remit, like just write those crazy one-liners for YouTube. But then YouTube's marketing team started ballooning just as we started working with them. And all of a sudden social began ballooning as well. So this magical thing happened where we went from a team of just myself and an intern to a team of like 35 to 40 people within a matter of months.
Oh my gosh.
And the agency kind of had to flip at that point and become more of like a social agency. And all of a sudden, myself and just 1 or 2 other people had to hire 40 people. So like you said, I went from being a creative to building a team and managing it. And it was such a crash course in it. It was obviously super stressful, but also exhilarating and an amazing learning curve. So that was fascinating. And that was really, the next few years were, I think, among the best because, managing YouTube social, and the way it worked for many of those years was they outsourced the whole thing to us. There was nobody social on the brands on their side. So they were just like, "Here, take it and run." And a lot of that was you're fed the fire hose of culture. We actually had a team where there were at least four people on our team who spent 80% of the day watching YouTube videos. They watched like 1,000 a day, and they would figure out which ones were the most interesting ones. How do we put these into like a list? How do we write copy around them, make them interesting? And you're kind of DJing YouTube for the world. And that was just, oh, what a great experience that was. So that was just fascinating because you are being fed the fire hose of culture. You are kind of seeing all the memes come up. And back then, I think a lot more of the memes lived on YouTube. So we were just in it. And then how do you take that and spit out like, "Hey, here's the best ones, here's the interesting ones." And then as time went on, our remit grew and we were helping with campaigns. It's like, how do you take everything you guys know from being in YouTube all day and transpose that into a campaign and make that into a larger advertising campaign for YouTube? So it was fascinating stuff. And also at that time, the idea of YouTube creators, which then became influencers, just started becoming a thing. And so being on the kind of ground floor for influencers at YouTube was this amazing experience. So that it's hard for me to describe a typical day during those years because I was managing a huge team. We were trying to figure it out. Had a lot of brilliant people around me who were just amazing and doing great jobs and everything. And then the last thing I'll say is the last thing I did at that agency that I really just adored was at one point Hasbro came to us, and I thought Hasbro, like I said, like I'm just totally a kid at heart. And they said, "Hey, we have a kind of this like really specific thing. We're curious if you guys want to do." "What is it?" "Okay." They said, they've spent all this. It started as Hasbro Games. They said, "We spent all this time marketing board games and thinking we knew what we were doing." But then they had one of their board games, an old game. Some grandfather in Ireland had pulled it out of his shelf and played it with his son. That video went viral, and that game was it was outselling every other game they had. And they said, "Wait a second, we're marketing totally wrong right now. And you guys are the YouTube guys, so what do we do?" So the next 3 years we spent, and this was just, so fun.
Oh.
So the next few years we spent creating the system for them, which what we would do is we built a team that was really good at social listening. And they would say, what's going on, not in the world of board games, not in the world of toys, but in the world of play. Like how are we really smart about figuring out how people are expressing how they play online? And then how do we take all those learnings and then we give that to our creative team? Our creative team creates 50 ideas for board games, 50 ideas for what to do with like Star Wars action figures, 50 ideas for what to do with Play-Doh. And then we go to their game development teams and we help them build the next generation of toys and games. So that was maybe the highlight. It was so fun. And it was so fascinating figuring out how do you really funnel culture into product creation. And it didn't work a lot of the time. It was super experimental, but it was just this fascinating journey that we went on with a lot of different teams at Hasbro. And I think, a lot of interesting things came out of it.
Thank you for walking us through that. Here, okay, so many questions. Such an interesting journey. And I do also want to ask you about your time at Max, but one of the things I want to highlight is I think people who are just graduating college, just graduating business school, or early in their career really feel like, okay, I'm supposed to have this all figured out and mapped out, and I'm supposed to be here for like 5 years and there. And you've taken risks. You've done many different things. You said it was random. It makes complete sense looking back, but I'm just curious if you have advice to those people who are like, I might not be happy in what I'm doing right now, but I feel like I'm supposed to be doing it, or they just feel kind of stuck. Even when I just think about you turning down Columbia, that's a big thing to turn down. And I imagine a big part of that was following your gut, but just curious, like general advice for like young people who are navigating this, because when you talk about your career, it's like you were following what worked at the time instead of, and maybe you felt at the time you're supposed to also have it planned out, but I'm just curious what advice you have on that topic.
100%. That's where I love talking about that specifically, because the first couple of things is the two caveats that I think are important in that I am generally a very risk averse person. I'm not like this, like, woohoo, let's go. So I think it's important to note that I'm risk averse, I'm anxious, and also I consider myself quite lazy. And I think it's important to say all that up front because people hear this like, no. But it's like, no, dude, if you consider that you're lazy or you're very risk averse, you're going to say, this isn't something I should do. But dude, I consider myself lazy and risk averse. And this is just kind of the path that I took. So my advice is the first thing is to acknowledge the idea of survivorship bias, which I think, there's an author that I love called Chuck Wendig who talks about this a lot when he writes about writing. He says, look, any advice I give, it's advice that worked for me, because I think a lot of times writers say, hey, here's how you do it. And then the more you read about it, the more you do it yourself. You're like, no, this is ultimately what worked for me. And when you see how things work, and there's always so much luck involved in everything, I think that's a big part of it as well. So that caveat aside, my advice, first of all, is I think I was lucky in a lot of ways. I do think that there are ways to influence your luck. Google that, because there's a great book about that. And I think it's a really interesting place to start. There are ways that you can actually, just in the behaviors you have and the way you look at life and the way you approach things, there are ways you can cultivate luck. I'll tell you my biggest failure in cultivating luck. I'm very introverted, so I don't go out and socialize a ton and go network. I think that's a huge thing I've missed out on, where I've gotten lucky in that I make some close friendships, and those close friendships really have helped me out along the way. But I think if you network, you do even better. I think it's the number one thing I would say if you're early in your career, the biggest misconception I had. So when I was going through it, I spent 6 years teaching and then 4 years making a documentary. So I started in marketing at the age of 30. And when I started, my title was a junior strategist. Now, every other junior strategist was 21 years old, right? So I'm in there and I'm like, okay, I felt like a loser. I am sitting here where all my bosses are younger than me. All my bosses' bosses are younger than me. And then I realized what happens, and it took a couple of years, but what happened is you catch up a lot faster if you had the experience before. So what I thought is I was always going to be far behind. But what ended up happening, and I've seen it with a lot of other people, is even if you start and you switch careers and you're starting either over or at a lower stage, I find that you tend to go a lot faster. So this strange thing happened where I came in and I was way older than the average junior strategist. But then for a lot of reasons, 6 years later, I was a very young SVP. So I was almost at a place where I was one of the people leading an agency, but it was because I'm coming in with all this experience from all these different places. So if your worry is that you're going to waste time doing something else and you're like, well, I really should stay in this career path I was going to do, or I should start in, let's say, marketing or whatever you want to start in, that's not necessarily the case. It's okay to try a lot of different things out. It's okay. I just find that you're going to have no idea what you want to do until you experiment a little bit. And I see folks who started their career and have gone through the whole thing. And part of me is like, dude, you didn't have to do that. Your 20s, I think it's okay for you to experiment a little bit. And I think, frankly, not to get into this too much, but I think we're at an interesting point in history and tech where we've just learned that we don't know what we're going to need in the next 10, 20 years in terms of what our viable careers. We're not sure. So I think it's okay to experiment. I think, if you'd asked before the AI boom, and you said, hey, what's the safest, best job? A lot of people say, oh, programmer, be a programmer. And now I think, I'm not going to say whether this is true or not. I'm just going to say, I know if you read about it right now, they would say potentially the opposite, that that's not a very safe profession right now. I'm not saying it is or isn't. I'm just saying what I read. But it's interesting to see. It's interesting to see how much that flipped in the last couple of years. So to me, it's like we really can't predict anything, and the latest few years has taught us that more than anything. So experimentation early on, I think, is great. I think there's a lot of things you can do and kind of jobs you can get early on that build a really interesting foundation. And I think in terms of risk taking, I think it's something I want to be very careful with, because I think there's always a level of privilege in being able to take risks. And so to me, I'm not going to say go nuts and go crazy. I think my brother and I had this really aha moment when the documentary had gone to South by Southwest, and it was having its world premiere at this documentary festival in Canada. And we were there, and there was this big event called The Future of Documentaries. And everyone in the room came to see, everyone's very curious. With all the documentary filmmakers are sitting in one room, anxious to hear what the person says. And the first line out of his mouth was, FYI, there is no future in documentaries. Nobody's ever going to get rich doing this, but ... all of you have trust funds, so it doesn't matter. And my brother and I, we were like, wait, what? We don't have trust funds. And everyone else laughed at me. That I was like, wait, does everyone else have trust funds? And it was just this amazing just moment of, oh my God, check your privilege. It's taking a risk is not always something that I'm semi-risk averse, but I do think taking small risks and using your intuition and your gut, as they say, all your intuition or your gut it's your brain subconsciously deciding things that you're not conscious of why it's doing, but it's doing it at I'm sorry how to articulate this. There's a lot of intelligence that's going on behind the scenes when it comes to your intuition and your gut. So I do think listening to it is a really big deal. I think there's obviously all the times you have to figure out, is this my gut or my anxiety? But I think in general, follow your gut more than you would think. I think often it'll kind of like lead you, if not in the correct path in terms of success, in the correct path in terms of the journey you should take.
What I would give to have heard everything that you just said 7 years ago, because it took me so long to quit acting, because I was like, I'm going to be starting over.
Yes.
I don't have experience in something else. So like, yes. I have 15, whatever years, I don't know the number, in acting. So if I go to something else, I'm starting at zero. So then how am I going to catch up? How is that possible? And so I overstayed my welcome in that industry because I was too afraid to do the starting over. So what I'm hoping is people kind of listen to what you're saying. And if they feel they're in between and just too afraid to take the leap, but they really want to, they maybe consider doing it.
100%. I mean, you're a fantastic story for that too. I feel like it's the same thing. It's, and I think a lot of times it was partially necessity. It's, at the end of the day, I did the documentary because I was just getting so frustrated in not doing something creative that I did that. And then I did marketing because I was getting married and I needed stability. And I think a lot of the choices that we make, if you're creative or you want to get into this stuff, it's really, the main question is often about stability. It's like, do I need stability? Do you need it practically? Do I need stability because the life I want to have? Or do you need it psychologically, which is, I'm a lot more creative when I have a day job and I know I have a stable income and I don't have to worry about that, so I can free up my mind to be creative. I think so much of the question you're asking in your 20s and 30s is kind of like that dance between stability, creativity, and how they work together.
Yeah. And that's why I quit acting, because I needed stability and I didn't want to live in New York City and I wanted to know where I was going to live. Like, I didn't want to just keep moving every 10 seconds. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Max now, and just about your team and what inspires you about your team, and anything you're allowed to share about your day-to-day and your current role?
Absolutely. I am unbelievably blessed when it comes to both my team and my role. It's just a fascinating remit, I think. What it ended up being, and again, these things I think just happen randomly. Again, like as you make decisions in life, understand that no matter what decisions you make, life and randomness and luck are going to play into them in a really interesting way. So for this, It was, I I was getting very tired of doing social media. I had done it for 15 years at the time. I needed
Wow.
a break. Being always on is really tough, whether you're in the trenches or managing it. So I decided 2019, I was like, okay, I need a break. I need to do something. A lot of my friends and colleagues said, well, look, if you really want to do something, you're clearly not exactly sure what, step back and start freelancing. And again, as you get older, the risk aversion grows because you're like, okay, now I have a family. I don't, so I was kind of freaking out, but I tried it. And I freelanced and I did a few small things. And then an old friend of mine said, hey, there's this role at HBO, which on paper sounds not at all like you, but being that I'm here and seeing what it is, it's exactly your speed. It was on the product team. I have zero product experience, but it was managing a program that was basically talent recommendations, which was taking talent all the way from influencers to, A-list talent and having them create recommendations around different titles on HBO Max at the time. And I was like, no, that's perfect. It melds documentary filmmaking and social and my influencer experience. So I was doing that as a freelancer. And, my first take was like, oh my God, there is such warmth at this company. I knew it was going to be brilliant people. Everybody was absolutely brilliant, but also very warm. That is an amazing environment. And then the twists and turns of any big company happen. And a few years later, thankfully I'm out of product because I have zero product experience and my imposter syndrome was through the roof. I mean, just absolutely through the roof. But once the shifts had happened, all of a sudden I was in a marketing role. I was on the social team. I thought, oh, this is, where I spent my entire career. But I had this amazing luxury where I was to the side of it a little bit, where I wasn't in the day-to-day that I had gotten a little bit burnt out doing. I was, and I currently am. My role is split between influencers and creators, which is something I've always been fascinated by, especially all the time I spent in YouTube. And then innovation, which is a lot of what I was doing with Second Skid. I think it's important to say too, as you're looking at your career, that you're never quite sure, how do I put it? When you're writing your resume, I think something you realize the older you get is there are 1,000 different ways to write it, focusing on different things, and they're all valid and they're all true. One way I could write my resume is being just social media all the way from when I marketed my documentary all the way through. But when somebody was talking about innovation, I said, it's funny. If I look at my career that way, it's almost more valid. I spent 3 years being one of the first people to really delve deep into virtual communities. And then if you were into social, the first 7-8 years of social media were all about innovation, because now we take it for granted that there's only 3 or 4 platforms. Back then, there were constantly new platforms. Everyone is innovating, and it was up to creative strategists and social strategists to figure out what platforms make the most sense. How do we innovate on those platforms? What platforms don't look like they have a future? So there was so much innovation happening there, and it was like, oh my gosh, like this job, this role I have now is just a great fit because it is taking everything I loved about innovation in the social role and everything I loved about influencers. So current role is half influencers and creators, half innovation. On the innovation side, a lot of what we're doing is we are looking ahead at our biggest properties, the House of the Dragons of the world. We're getting a sense of what are the interesting things that are happening in emerging technologies. And we're saying, okay, how do we do this balance where we're storytelling first? What are the stories that this series is about? What are the stories that this campaign is about? And how are we using the technology in service of that? But of course, there's always the element that there's going to be a lot of upcoming or hot technologies that people are going to want us to try experimenting with. And so we're doing that. And I think the way that our team is built is I love the way it's built. We're a center of excellence model, which means that the series campaigns, the folks that are in charge of campaigning the series, come to us and say, here's vaguely what we're looking for, or here's exactly what we're looking for. And we work with them. And then on the other side, we have a bunch of different agencies in our Rolodex. We're constantly looking at agencies to get a sense of who has what strengths. And we start to partner with them. And then it becomes this really fun process where we have the series marketers here. We sit in the middle. We have the agencies over here. We're all coming up with ideas. We kind of triangulate on the best ones. And then we kind of go from there. So it's just this really fantastic kind of amalgamation of a lot of things I've done. And I think going back to the advice, I think as you work through your career, you're going to see opportunities like that where you just get a sense of like, oh, to your point, Jane, like even though these 4 things aren't technically on my resume, I did spend a lot of my 9 to 5 doing these things, which is why a lot of times as you're looking for jobs, as you're peering in, I wouldn't just go by titles. The first question I ask if I'm ever interviewing is, what's the day-to-day? What am I doing 9 to 5? Because it's often worlds apart from the way that the job is described.
Yeah. Okay. Your team is so cool and your trajectory is amazing. One more question for you, because I am positive that there will be young people who listen to your journey and what you're doing now and think, oh, I want to do that. That's so cool. You're at the pinnacle of culture. You're working on the coolest series. You're working on social media. It's creative. It's such an interesting company. To a young person that looks at your career and feels inspired and aspires to maybe follow in your footsteps someday, what advice do you have for navigating their way there? Because you took many twists and turns. If they hear what you're saying and they're like, "Oh, I want to do that in like 5 years," do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, great, great. The best question, really. Gosh, I hope so. The first thing is, if I can do it, anyone can do it. So I think, to me, it's please. If you're listening to this, I absolutely think you can do this. If I can do it, anyone can. The second thing is understanding that everything is constantly shifting now in terms of what careers are, what jobs are, what paths are. And I'm sure you've read it online or you've heard it online, but nobody knows what they're doing. Everyone is faking it. Everybody has raging imposter syndrome at, most of the time. So the fake it till you make it thing is so much more valid than I realized when I started here. I mean, it's absurd. You hear it all the time, but it is so valid. You see so many people who you think, wait, how did they get to where they are? And as you kind of get to know them better, you're like, no, they faked it for years. And then they just started understanding what the job was. I think confidence is such an enormous part of how you succeed. I am very not confident and I've struggled with it. I see confident people all the time that I'm like, I can't believe you are where you are. And they're there because they're super confident. It doesn't have to do with their skills or their talent. They're just very confident what they're doing. And often we really look up to confident people and we really believe what they're saying. And that gets you far as well. So I think the takeaway, honestly, is don't be afraid to experiment early on. Don't feel try not to take in the rejections you're going to feel early on too much. Things are going to work, things aren't going to work. The idea of fail forward, I think, is always super valid. And I think, I hate saying it because it's so cliche, but whether it's your gut or your intuition or whatever, get a sense of how you feel in a job at any point. If things suck about it, don't be afraid to rethink what you're doing. And I'll also say one of the most important things is, as cool as jobs are, as cool as a career might be, right now I feel very, very fortunate. But I think there's something you read a lot that I think is very true, which is if you're at a job that's in any way corporate or in a field like that, or even not, 80 to 90% of the happiness you're going to feel is if you have a good manager. If you have a good manager, that's a job you want to hold on to, at least for a while. You're going to learn a lot from whatever job you're in, and everything you do, you're going to find helps you no matter what path you're on. You're going to find these strange parallels as you go through. Like, oh, weird. I wouldn't have guessed that innovation in my brain is 50% elementary school education, 50, 30% like this documentary I made about virtual worlds. It all comes back to play. So to me, don't freak out too much if you think you're not learning at the moment. If you have a great manager and you feel there's some validity to what you're doing, don't be afraid to stick around for a second as you figure out the next step. And yeah, just check in on yourself. I think that's the biggest thing. Check in on yourself. See what you can do in terms of I think don't be afraid of taking risks. I will say they are risks. It's not like I had a lot of false starts and a lot of, like you said, in retrospect, things make sense. But at the time, I had a lot of false starts, a lot of moments where I was like, what am I doing with my life? A lot of times that I felt like an absolute failure. And also, more than anything, help from your friends. A lot of what I've done, a lot of it is my brother really helped me. He was the one that really helped motivate me to go into documentary filmmaking with him, which changed the trajectory of my life because I was risk averse. Another really good friend of my best friends was the one who pushed me into marketing. And, there's a few people, and another one of my good friends is the one that pushed me into HBO. So I think a lot of times it's cultivate those relationships. If you're an extrovert, great, go network the hell out of it. If you're not an extrovert, try to do as good a job as you can at finding a good group of solid core friends and help them, and they'll help you. And I think you navigate the whole thing together. So to me, I think a lot of it in retrospect there was a lot of luck, but there was a lot of close friends and colleagues who really helped me navigate it. And, do your best to try to pay that forward when you can.
Yeah, which you definitely do. I think that's an awesome way to wrap this conversation. And I just want to know, I think this will be super helpful to anyone who feels or anyone who is introverted and feels like the business world and the networking component of everything is very overwhelming. Because when you say that you're introverted and then you highlight the importance of a manager, that makes sense. You spend a lot of time with that person. Yep. Therefore, the relationship really matters. Having close friends. I'm the exact same way. And so I think there are a lot of people who get overwhelmed and feel like they can't kind of break into the corporate world because they don't feel like they're outgoing enough or any of that. But clearly you've demonstrated that you can do it and be yourself. I know it was hard along the way, but I do think it's a testament to who you are as a person.
Well, try just one last bit. If you're introverted, read the book Quiet by Susan Cain. That book will change your life. And keep in mind that Obama is an introvert. Like you can be the president, be an introvert. Like I also felt very stifled being an introvert, but I think I was like, oh no, wait, there's tons of successful introverts.
Yeah, no, of course. And I'm going to read that book because I have not read that book.
So good.
Thank you so much for such an awesome conversation. Thank you for your authenticity, your honesty, your humility, and your kindness. This is, I'm positive, going to help young people who especially are creative. And I think a lot of people are going to identify and be inspired by the conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This is great.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Your Career Unscripted. If something about this conversation inspired you, I'd love to know. Feel free to message me on LinkedIn at Jane Bernhard if there's a guest you'd want to hear from, or if there's a type of background you'd like to learn from, and I'll do my best to make it happen. If you enjoyed the content, please subscribe to my Substack and socials, follow Texas Immersive Institute, and check out TXI's Patreon at patreon.com/Texas Immersive for more thought leadership on the immersive field. And of course, please share the episodes with anyone who you think might find them helpful. See you next time.